it is. How about now? Is that better? Can you hear me now? I'm assuming they can. Though, like, a yes, we can hear you, please stop shouting would be super appreciated. Okay, hang on. No, nobody? Nobody wants to say everything's clear now? I can hear you. Okay, I mean, so I did go over this right prior to the last exam, like what a 10 out of 10 question looks like. It's a level of detail, right? There's a sort of generalist answer that'll get you like a 6, 7, maybe an 8 out of 10. I don't know what the sniggering is about. You know, I don't want to go over it again in like too much detail, but I'll kind of run through some questions and sort of show you like an outline of how you should answer them. But kind of general rule, right? You want a fair bit of detail. And just like, here, I'll go to here and I'll erase this in a sec, but like, here's the rule, right? You have an open book. So, you know, bring in, you can use stats. You don't even have to remember them, right? So use stats. Use facts. Quotes. You know, if I have quotes on the screen, use them, right? Diagrams, obviously it's hard for you to do that because I don't know how Canvas is going to deal with you copying and pasting diagrams or whatever it happens to be. But, you know, dates. So if I'm asking you, like, you know, to outline the historical, you know, progression of youth jobs in Canada and the US, right? I had that whole big slide on it when we talked about work. You know, I give you a bunch of dates. Put those dates in, right? Give lots of details, lots of things like that. You know, any statistics I put in, anything, those are all fair game and those are all really good. For one, it shows more engagement with the course material, especially in an era where, you know, some people, I'm marking another exam right now in a different class, and I'm getting a lot of a particular reference to a particular author that does not exist. So it's a class, you know, don't worry, it's not your exam, you did great. She's in the class. But there's a lot of people like highlighting another topic that, by the way, chatbots hit all the time, right? But chatbots tend to be vague, right? Be specific, right? Be really specific. You know, if I ask you a question like, hang on, okay, can you identify yourself? You have just failed both this class and every class that I have power over. Sorry. Hang on, let me see if I can, I'm just kidding. I hate the 6-7 thing though. So like this question, right? If we were talking about, you know, marriage being a social justice issue, I'm asking for a piece of evidence, right? You've given you a ton of stuff in the third part of that family's lecture from Melissa Kearney that you could use as evidence for this, right? So you could use, you know, the fact that, like, you know, African Americans have the lowest marriage rate of any Americans, and consequently they have the highest, you know, single motherhood rate, poverty rate, lowest levels of academic attainment, all of these things, all connected to this question of kind of marriage as a social justice, right? And all you're being asked here is give a piece of evidence from the course for or against his argument, right? So you got to pick a piece of evidence, right? And this is like a statistic, a quote, a fact, you know, something. Especially, I gave you lots in that unit, and explain why it supports or undermines the argument. So be really super specific, right? Because it's open book. Now, if it was closed book and you're doing it in class, I'll accept vague general answers as a 10 out of 10, because you're at home, because you have your notes, because you can literally pull up everything that you've written down in the course. You can use AI. I do try to test these questions to see if AI generates anything close to an answer that is decent, and mostly, if it does, I take the question out or I rewrite it. But be really specific, right? The specifics are, can you get 10 out of 10 without the readings? Yes, there's enough in the lectures to get 10 out of 10, right? I give you, I don't want to, I sound like I'm blowing my own horn, and I'm really not. But there's enough in the lectures, right, that for the questions, you can be really, really specific. However, if you want to bring in stuff from the readings, that's all good too. That's perfectly fine, and I'm more than happy with that. But you don't have to have done a deep dive into the readings. And I swear, if I have to answer that question ever again, I will explode. No, I'm kidding. Sorry, I just went through a very convoluted email conversation with a student in a different class, asking where are the slides for the course. And in every week of the course, there's a tab. It links to my Google Drive, because there's no space on Canvas for all the slides, that says week 1 PDF and PowerPoint, and they just didn't know it was there, and it's like week 9 of the semester, and I, had to do my best to not yell at the email in my office where everyone can hear, and it sounds like I'm a crazy person. Okay, does the class average typically stay the same across all 3 midterms? So it depends on the year. I will say this year, midterm 1, your score was, I would say, on the lower side that I've seen for this class, which is okay. Your question's funny. What typically happens when the class average is low on the first one, it bumps up on the second one because people study harder. And if it's high on the first one, which was not, it tends to go down because people are like, what a waste of time class. I can pass this in my sleep. So typically I would expect this one to go up a little bit, kind of towards the low 80s as a class average. Okay. Does the class average typically stay the same? Okay. How much should you know about the 2-parent privilege stuff? Up to you. How well do you want to do on the exam? If you want to do well on the exam, I did spend, 2 whole classes on it, maybe 2.5. So I would suggest you should probably know it pretty well, but it's up to you. Maybe you can take a risk that ChatGPT has read the book too. I don't know. Sorry, it's like, how well should we know the concepts from the course to do well in the course? Okay. Will my tested on my rants based on, no. Course content, usually stuff related in the slides. Do I rant a lot? Maybe, who knows? I will ask you about that one student that didn't know where the PowerPoints for the course were by the 9th week. That will be a test question. How would I recommend studying for open book exams? Cleverly? Thoroughly? Make good notes, right? The trick with open book exams is they're open book, but you don't have time to go through everything that's in the slides, right? Trying to find stuff from the slides and mixing it with your notes is going to be really difficult. So you kind of have to make new notes that are really quick access, and headers, so you can find stuff really fast. Color code them. Color coding is great. Whatever works for you. Or develop an eidetic memory and just remember everything. That would work too. Okay, would I increase the time limit? Okay. So, okay, that's actually a very good question. Oops, I cleared the wrong one. Having a day. All right, if you could resubmit that question. I forget what it was. The first midterm. Okay, yeah, so basically the way this is going to be split is going to be 2 work questions, 2 families questions, and 1 sex and intimacy question, right? So 2-2-1. So two work, 2 families, 2 sex and intimacy ones. So that's the split on the questions. Okay. I will wait a moment. I will drink my purloined Diet Coke. I've been slowly stealing all the cans of Diet Coke out of my colleague's office, and she doesn't know yet. So I have to return an entire case of Diet Coke before she finds out. So that's my weekend goal, is buy a case of Diet Coke. I'm not a bad person. I just make bad choices. Okay, let's I guess let's jump into this. But yes, will I increase the amount of time? I think that was the question. I'll think about it. I do feel like 90 minutes is enough to do 5 questions with a fair degree of detail. You know, and the other thing that I have to be careful of is technically the exams for this class should be 50 minutes, you know, so 60 minutes at the kind of outside, and I've already bumped it up to 90. I don't want to make the class, like the exam time, onerous for people either. Because some people are going to use that whole 2 hours, but they might not have the time. So I don't want to, you know, make it too big. I think 90 minutes is probably sufficient, but I will consider it, and maybe I'll feel merciful on Sunday night. I don't know. You know, who can say? This is my fun laptop with the much more fun pen that has an eraser on the back. So this is good times. All right. I'm gonna check one more time for questions. Do it for Twilight Sparkle. I will do it for, I know who that is, Yasmin. I'm saying you shouldn't. That's a really, really bad idea. It doesn't generate good topics. I'm not going to try to stop you because I don't care. But, you know, sorry, I'm being a little salty today. It's just been a really long day. It's not about you guys. But, you know, people do use them. I can tell, like, it's not rocket surgery, as my dad would say. But, you know, they don't generate really good answers to these questions. And I try to program the questions against the chatbots so that, you know, there's a little bit of vague wording, so the chatbot spews out a bunch of random garbage. Trust me, there was some random garbage on the last exam. You know, some of the stuff it said about Gen X was truly hilariously vague and dumb. I should bring it out for you, but I don't want to embarrass anybody. But yeah, I wouldn't use it. Where are the quotes from? Oh, that's from Ryan Burge's blog. Same as those graphs. So it's you can just quote them on the slide, right? But they are from a Substack called Graphs about religion. He's my favorite. I like him. Okay. Oh, my brain is dead today. Okay, so is the split 2-2-1 the same for everyone, even though everyone has questions? Yes, because the questions are going to be split into banks, right? So I have a bank of questions for work, a bank of questions for families, a bank of questions for sex and intimacy. I'm going to tell Canvas, pick 2 from this bank, 2 from this bank, 1 from this bank. So yes. I'm not a goat. No, I'm kidding. I know what that means. Okay. Okay, I think I answered that already. Yes, graphs about religion. What was the average on the last midterm? 78, I believe. I should definitely increase the time limit. Oh, I know students want that. I will think about it. Pray for me, or something. Or, yeah, pay an Etsy witch to curse me. I don't know which one. Yeah, you know, whatever feels right. Go for it. Okay, all good. Okay, you want to do some questions? You want to do some questions? Did I put the same question twice? I did not. Okay. I thought I had for a sec. All right, let's erase that. Okay. So I got 5 example questions. We can talk about how to answer these questions. Okay. So This one. So this is a question I used to use. It's now sort of a dead letter question, so I've taken it out. And a lot of these questions I either wrote specifically for practice exams or for old exams, and I've taken them out over time. So, they're not a perfect representation of what will be on the exam, but I think a pretty good one. All right, so how did the economic crisis of the 1970s lead to changes in the youth employment market? Okay, so that's all that big, I had that one slide in work where I talked about like all of these transitions. So here, right, somewhat involved, you're gonna wanna talk about kind of two strands. So, we can say about 1945 to about 1973, we have, a booming economy. Right, booming economy, people are easily able to come out of school, either high school or university, and get good jobs in things like manufacturing, civil service, and other forms of industry, like white collar work, right? So there's good jobs for both your blue collar and your white collar kind of streams. What happens, right? You get 1973, that fateful year. Now, if you want to be really fun about it, right, you can talk about, OPEC and the Arab oil embargoes, which I'm going to put as AOE, Arab oil embargoes, that resulted from, I think it's the Yom Kippur War, or, the Arab-Israeli War, if you want to just be really general, right? The Arabs, not being happy with American support of Israel, decided to reduce the amount of oil that they were going to pump and sell. So this did a couple of things. It sent prices high, so it bumped up. That's an arrow, by the way. Inflation. Added with, if you want to talk the general 1970s, you had a government debt crisis. My pen is a little slow. And again, I've outlined this all before, right? So these two things together caused a phenomenon called stagflation. A stagnant economy and inflation. So the economy slowed right down. So that itself hurt youth jobs. All right. Added. What else is happening in the 1970s? You get Asian economies. C'est quoi? Okay. Asian economies, right, that start to compete. And here you can give specific examples if you want. For cars, you have Toyota and Honda. And if you want to talk electronics, you could talk about a lot of things. And eventually that text will fuck off. I mean, what? Sorry, I'm leaning on my keyboard. Pardon my French. Do I want to keep? Yeah, I'll keep it. And I'll just keep writing forever. All right, so electronics, right? I must have been leaning on the arrow. I think it was the button on my shirt. You would have like Sony, and other Japanese companies whose names I can't remember, Fujitsu and such, but let's just stick with Sony, right? So what does this do? And that's increased competition in manufacturing, and eventually you get the Koreans in there, and then the Chinese as well in the 1980s. So what happens is you get a general shift for blue collar and white collar workers, out of manufacturing and civil service, which I'm just going to write as CS, into, service industry, or what you might call McJobs, right? Okay, so that's the story, right? Basically, a lot of the good jobs that were available to people sort of disappeared in the 1970s, and those tracks, started to decline, right? Less and less jobs there, less and less possibilities for young people. So that's the first part, right? So that's fairly involved. It's 5 marks. Now, for 3 marks, this is a pretty easy one, which I think is why I took this question out, because it was scoring really high, because basically it was like, does that historical moment still impact young people today? If I was to redo this, I would probably make this 1 and the why 4, but I don't use this question anymore. So the why, so because you can say yes or no. Yes, it still affects people today. No, it doesn't. And then explain the why, right? And here, if you were explaining the why, and let's say you said yes, right, which is the correct answer, by the way, it still affects them because, a lot of these jobs have never returned, right? So it's increasingly difficult for young people to find good paying jobs with a secure future coming out of school because these crises never resolved, right? These jobs in manufacturing and, civil service never really came back for young people. So, they still get stuck in that lower tier of the service industry. And, if you want to throw a little honey in the kettle, I don't know if that's an expression that any human being has ever used, but I just used it now. They need more education. Okay, right, more education in order to get those base tier jobs. You can link it to educational inflation, right? Super easy. Just lots of detail in that first part, hopefully. America deserved the embargo, free Palestine. Cool. Not at all a political comment. Twilight Sparkle would greatly appreciate the time limit. She told you the other day. If it had been Rainbow Dash, I would have 100% jumped at that. I'm much more of a Rainbow Dash fan. I always found Twilight a little bit pretentious, to be honest. Giving me lessons at the end of the episodes and all that. Okay. Can you use media? I can't imagine where Charlie and the Chocolate Factory would, unless you're talking about the Oompa Loompa crisis of the 1960s. But unfortunately, that's a little known incident in British history. Okay, what kind of civil service jobs disappear? All kinds, right? So all kinds of jobs in kind of the entry tier of government, especially, like kind of base bureaucracy jobs, tended to disappear. Okay, well, I'm going to need a signed letter with hoof prints to verify. His dad and yeah, I see what's happening here. His dad and the toothpaste. Oh, I think that's a Charlie and the Chocolate Factory joke. Guys, I haven't seen this movie in like 25 years. Okay, so I think I answered this, and we're getting silly. So maybe we should just go home. If you answer yes, if you ask a yes or no question for one of the questions, could you answer yes or no and still get 10 out of 10 if you defend it with evidence plus very well? Yes, 100%. Even if I maybe don't agree, if the evidence is good, I would probably still give you 10 out of 10, as long as it's well thought out, well put together, and makes sense. It's very unlikely that you would get that kind of question. 100% if you take sociology of religion with me, there are questions like that, where there's a bunch of different ways to go. It's a little bit less so in this class. Okay, wow, my brain. Okay, this is, I had like 5 student meetings this morning, and then a speaker series, which I half watched, and then a meeting of a committee, and then 2 more student meetings, and my brain is just like, I can't anymore for today. Okay. Oh, so I'm struggling through this one. Okay, so what historical, like the longest break I had today was to microwave my lunch. That was 3 minutes. It's super fun. Be a professor. It's very, very good work-life balance. I kid, it's an awesome job. Okay, what historical trends have made it necessary for young people today to earn some type of post-secondary degree to flourish economically? Right here, you're kind of winking at the same thing as the last question I showed you. You would have to identify some kind of economic trend. So it could be, right, the shift to a service industry. This technically I think would probably be a better question for education, the education unit, but educational inflation, credentialism. I think I talked about both of them at the end of the work unit, right? Like I said, I probably won't have, this is not a question I would put on there because we've got new and different kinds of content, right? So, the rise of or increase in educational inflation because more people, right, that's a good answer. More people are getting an education today, which means it's worth less. So high school diploma is no longer enough to get you into that good tier of jobs. Now you need those increased levels of education to get you there. Okay. Explain one way that this has made the lives of young people better and one way it has made it more difficult. This is why I took this question out, actually. Because it was hard, people had a hard time figuring out, especially the way that it has made things better for young people. So I took this question out. I would probably rephrase this and let's do it on the fly. One way it has made life more difficult for them, right? And we'll talk about that at 5. Okay, so you could go with, more school, delayed adulthood. It's hard to write when your pen lags like this. This pen has never lagged before. Was this for this question? Oh, that would be a good one. I like that. Yeah, the TFW program. Okay. Historical trend. Yeah, like if you wanted to do this, talk about the TFWs, right? That's a really good one. Here, let's scrap this because I was having trouble thinking of an answer. So I talked about temporary foreign workers, right? The increase in the temporary foreign worker program following, so you could list out the history a little bit and you could say in 2015, right, there was an election that elected a new Canadian Prime Minister. That Prime Minister, I think I spelled that wrong. Sorry, being a jerk. Trudeau, right? Removed caps on the TFW program. And limits on TFWs. Right, so you remove the caps and limits on TFWs, right? And what did that do? Ultimately, it flooded the labor market. So you could add here, and I won't write it down because I'm running out of space and I'm running out of time. I want to get through a couple more of them, right? That argument that, the COVID era changes to the rules on international students that allowed them to work, beyond 20 hours a week, created further pressure on the labor market, right? Which meant that at the kind of low end, right, and especially in the more unskilled part of the labor market, there's just increased competition. So young people now need to, immediately get themselves to higher tiers of the job market in order to just get a job, right? So key pieces of information here are changes under Trudeau, the COVID era changes that happened in 2021, I believe, to address, some of the struggles that international students were having, allowing them to work more, which increased the labor supply. And you can talk about the rules that scrapped, like, caps. I think it used to be if unemployment was at 7 or 6% locally, you couldn't import a temporary foreign workers, and those caps were scrapped by Trudeau as well, right? You can talk about, limit here. You can talk about, limits of productivity gains, right? Where basically the Canadian economy has remained quite unproductive, meaning that you need more and more education in order to get those better tier jobs. Because there's not a lot of good productive jobs with high wages at the lower tier. So all good, and thank you for that example. You can give personal examples. I'm cool with some personal examples. Make sure they're pertinent, of course. But yeah, I've given grades for personal examples as long as they make sense and as long as they're illustrative, right? If you want to say that you've sent out 100 resumes, I'm cool with that, and I'm sorry that happened to you if that person exists. Okay, hang on. I can't erase now. Oh, right, I said I could keep those. So, why does Rigneris suggest that marriage is a social justice issue, right? So here, again, I would probably change the balance of this a little bit away from the 5, 2, 3, and probably make this worth a little bit less. Because it's the easiest part of the question to answer, and sometimes it's in this balance that I've screwed up these kinds of questions. But why does he suggest that marriage is a social justice issue? And here, summarize his argument. What is his argument? Essentially, that those who are married, right, tend to, have better outcomes. Their children have better outcomes. They bring more resources. They're healthier, and increasingly, right, it's polarized. Oops, what did I do there? Polarized. Right, so that the rich and the middle class and upper classes marry, and they marry each other, and the poor and working classes don't get married at all, right? So that's his argument. Now, a piece of evidence, right, from the course for or against his argument. All you have to do here is, for this question, is you would have to go into all that Kearney stuff, because she provides a lot of empirical evidence, right, that married, and especially having, living in a household with two married parents as a child, increases your, chances of success in life by large measures, right? You could look at, the differences between, I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but they're all in there, right? As to the prevalence of people living in poverty based on the educational status of their moms, right? The marriage status of their moms. Unpartnered mothers versus partnered mothers, right? It's like, what is it? Unpartnered mother is, a child of an unpartnered mother is like 5 times more likely to live in poverty than the child of parents who are together, right? Same with an unpartnered father, right? So marriage, means that people were less likely to live in poverty and all of that fun stuff. So again, do that. Those statistics are all in that back half. You just have to find one that kind of works. Okay. I have other questions. This one would be pretty easy. Which again is probably why I ended up removing it. Actually, it's not probably why, it is why. But you have to explain the 2 different models of marriage discussed in the course, right? That's capstone and foundation. So there you have to give a definition of both of them. Capstone, right? Marriage comes at the end. If I swipe like really hard, does it change slides? No, I don't know what happened. Sorry, maybe it was that. Okay, capstone, it comes at the, typically later in adulthood, once you've hit other markers, right, as a sort of decoration or capstone or end point of a life that's already kind of well put together, right? So you get married after you have education, career, property ownership, maybe, although, for Gen Z, that's increasingly out of reach. Bless you. And all of those things. So, right, that'd be capstone. Foundation, you marry early, right? Often suffer periods of poverty and deprivation early in marriage, but you build through those other parts of adulthood together, right? And you do it as a couple. Okay, how would each of these, models affect the development of the concept of youth? So capstone, and this is right, you have to think about this a little bit, but I don't think it's too hard. And here you'd have to get back to this kind of term, of emerging adulthood, right? Emerging adulthood is largely connected to, and this is right, this period where you go from like 19 to 29 and you're not quite an adult because you haven't hit those markers yet. That's related to the capstone model. So it would mean a concept of youth gets a lot longer, right? Because the expectation is that, all of those fun adult things that tend to mark you off as an adult happen quite late, versus a foundations model, which is going to be a much shorter period of youth, right? Why is it going to be a shorter period of youth? Very, very simply, it's a much shorter period of youth because you step into those adult roles much more quickly and then build through it with another person, especially marriage, right? So you get married, which is like one of our, typical traditional kind of key markers of adulthood. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Can you bring in concepts not explored in the lectures / readings? Yes. I would just say, if you do this, just tell me where it came from, right? Just tell me, I'm taking this from SOC 392 or from Psychology 444 or whatever it happens to be. Just tell me where the concept came from, right? You learn this in your psychology class, you learn this in social stratification or whatever, so that I know, because I immediately know that ChatGPT is not putting that note in there, right? Because or any other chatbot. So just tell me where it came from, and I am fine. And always kind of interested in that. Okay. This one, you'll probably get a question kind of similar to this either here or on the final. Explain the concept of cheap sex, right? So again, you know, this is probably worth 3. And then, actually I'd make it worth 4 because I can't make the math work otherwise. You know, so explain it. You just have to summarize the concept of the concept of cheap sex, right? So it is the triangulation of social effects brought on by contraception, online dating, and porn, and you probably want to give a little detail on what each of these do, right? So contraception splits sex and conception, or sex and babies, apart, allowing people to experiment sexually more. Online dating increases your dating pool and removes social obligations or social consequences of behavior in the dating market, right? And online porn, just, you know, it's a sort of endless supply of sexually gratifying content that allows people to eschew sex altogether because pornography is so cheap. And then you just got to connect it to maybe 1 or 2 other concepts in the course. So you could say, if you wanted to, connect it to capstone marriage. Maybe people, you know, and certainly Rigneris did this in the book, The Future of Christian Marriage, right? Well, maybe you want to connect it to capstone marriage, right? Cheap sex means people are more likely to adopt a capstone model than a foundation model. I know I'm almost out of time. I'll try to wrap it up here. You know, maybe you want to connect it to, you know, the 2-parent privilege, right? Why? Well, you know, men are making themselves less marriageable. Women still get together with them, as seen in the North Dakota shale example, right? They still father children often out of wedlock, or seen by the statistics, you know, in general, that we see a rise in non-married households in the US. And that ultimately, you know, leads to bad social consequences for those kids, because those dads bring no resources, right? A lot of times, you know, cheap sex maybe means they're not making themselves marriageable, they bring little resources, and therefore, you know, children are born into situations that are not optimal for their flourishing long term. Something like that. All right, last question slide. How many marks is Q5 worth each sentence? Okay, yeah, 4, and then probably 3 per other, like, because I've got 2 other ideas presented in the course, right? So 3 each for each idea, so that part would be 6. That's how I would split that one up. Okay, that's all I got. That's what I got. I'm gonna go home, probably. Hello, Ashley. Sure.